so essentially the accounting interface is served by three database elements. The database forms, which are used for inputting accounting database or accounting data. The database queries, which are used to search the database and retrieve accounting data from it. For example, if you wanted to retrieve information about a customer to enter a sales order, the system would execute a query. And then we have database reports, which present the output of queries. When you're ready to prepare an income statement, for example, you would select the appropriate time and format, and a query would be executed to retrieve the accounts and account balances that should appear on the income statement. And so this provides us with an example of what we call a GUI, or a graphical user interface. And one of the features that made QuickBooks so popular early on was its easy to use GUI. The home page is used for navigation, and it shows a flowchart of tasks that can be accomplished. Also, we see that on-screen forms use GUI for data entry, and so in the right-hand corner we see the home page, which presents us with the navigation of QuickBooks, and then down in the bottom left-hand corner we see an example of a form that can be used to enter data into the database. And you can see that with that form, it really makes it very intuitive for users to enter data versus going in and entering the data directly into the table itself. User interface tools that can be used when designing the interface include items such as icons, command buttons, radio boxes, which essentially can become on or off buttons, check boxes, text boxes, list boxes, and tab controls. These interface tools can be used to improve data validation or to increase the accuracy and integrity of the data as it's entered into the database. And so you may recall this figure from earlier, and so when we're looking at the baseline accounting system, you can see that the vendor, customer, employee, bank, and financial modules use database forms to record their data input. The reports modules use database reports to display the database output. And some general guidelines that we use when we're designing a database form is that we really only want to enter the data once, right? That, again, we talked about this with respect to cost and accuracy earlier. To the extent possible, we want to use data validation. So, for instance, if the data that we're entering can only be text, we would want to design the form so that in that particular field, the user couldn't enter numbers, right? We want to use auto entry where possible. So perhaps we'll choose an option that allows us to select from a drop-down selection of data to use. We want to format the data entry forms to mirror hard copy forms so that if the user is entering data into the database from an actual hard copy form, it can be entered approximately in the same way it appears on that hard copy form. We want to create user-friendly forms, and we want to also implement appropriate security measures around the forms so that they can't be changed by the users. So again, when designing database forms, it's important to use this accounting insight, enter data once. If the same data is repeatedly entered twice on the same forms or entered more than one time on the same form, it should auto-populate so that it auto-fills in any subsequent fields after it's been entered once. Again, cost and accuracy considerations drive this. Alright, and so our next insight says that to save time entering data, mirror database forms and paper forms. And that makes sense if we look at this from the perspective of the users who are using these forms. If data will need to be transferred from paper to on-screen, then to save time, the database forms and the paper forms should mirror one another. Otherwise, the data entry takes much longer as the user is searching all over the input form to find the data that's entered into the on-screen form. In addition, with this searching around, if the user is jumping around within the form, then it increases the opportunity for error. And so some typical accounting data entry forms for the customer module corresponding to the same typical customer transactions include a sales order or invoice form, a credit memo, the customer payment receipt, or the deposit ticket. Some typical forms, the entry forms used for the vendor module include the payroll order form, the receiving form, the bill entry form, or the check form. Some typical accounting data entry forms for the employee module might include the time tracking form, so all timesheets should look the same. If an employee is filling out a manual timesheet and someone else is keying that into the system directly, then the two forms should look alike to, again, avoid the problems and the disadvantages we talked about earlier. And the payroll withholding form as well. And then finally, some typical data entry forms with respect to the banking module is the check form, the deposit form, and the bank reconciliation form. And lastly is the financial module, and we might understand that having an on-screen journal entry form that mirrors any manual journal entry form could really avoid issues related to the period of the journal entry, or the general account ledger used, or the debit and credit side of journal entries could be easily messed up if the forms aren't the same as if the database forms aren't the same as the manual forms. And so here we see 4 different basic types of accounting reports that are used, and there are many accounting reports. And so this idea that these are the only 4 reports is not what this is meant to illustrate, but just to kind of keep in mind that there are these basic types of reports. The financial accounting and regulatory reports, right? And again, we get back to who the users were. So we had investors, creditors, and regulatory agencies that might use these types of reports. We have all different types of tax reports that maybe need to be generated out of the system that are used when filing federal, state, and local taxes. We have different management reports that are really provided to internal users, such as managers, for their decision making. And these management reports run the whole gamut from project costing reports to perhaps employee performance reports. So there are a lot of different reports that can make up this group. And then we have this idea of sustainability reports that we'll talk to much later in the semester that deals with an enterprise's responsiveness to economic, environmental, and social sustainability challenges. And these reports could be used both internally and externally to the organization. And this is a very rapidly developing area that's very interesting. We'll talk about it much later on. And so we'll notice here that the results of queries can be displayed in database reports or database forms. For example, the query to retrieve an income statement accounts and balances for the past year could appear in a database report. The query for customer information for a customer with the last name Smith might appear in an on-screen database form used to enter new customers. So queries are used in multiple different ways, and the reports that build off of queries also provide information in multiple different formats. And so here what we do is to just want to keep in mind that database queries to extract data from multiple related database tables. These queries may provide online information. It could provide the input to reports that are then run based on the queries, or they could provide information to assist in the completion of a form which might be used to input data into the database. Most database software includes a query builder tool to streamline building queries. These permit you to build queries without using programming language. However, it may not be suitable to use with some complicated queries. One of the more commonly used queries is this structured query language, SQL or SQL, and that's commonly used across the industry to access databases. And this is an example of a Microsoft Access query builder called Query by Example. And the database tables are displayed across the top. Then you can simply click and drag the fields you want displayed into the bottom portion of the screen. If you would like to search on a specific query, such as last name, then that information is entered into the criteria row in the bottom portion of the screen. And so again, you can see that this is Microsoft's attempt at making these database queries very user-friendly and not dependent on the user having to understand some SQL or structured query language tool, but being able to get some basic functional queries executed without having all of the needing to know all of the programming language that literally sits behind all of the query that you see here accomplished by just a click and drag. So when the query is run, the query builder creates this SQL programming code or a structured query language code behind the scenes. This is an example of a SQL code that was created by the query builder in LMS Access for the query created in the slide we just looked at. Although accounting professionals may not write SQL programming code, it has become more important than ever for accounting professionals and auditors to be able to at least read some SQL. SQL injections, where incorrect SQL code is injected into the query to extract unauthorized data, is often used in cyber attacks. For this reason, the accounting professional should be able to read a basic SQL statement to identify whether there's anything improper. And to this end, we note that there are 4 basic parts to the SQL query. An action, so for a query, the action is select. A field, and that indicates the fields. As you recall, we talked about fields and records and tables, right? So a field, which is to be extracted, are specified. Then tables, and that's identifying the table that will be used in the query, which are specified. And then criteria, and the search criteria to search for and retrieve must be identified. So we have actions, fields, tables, and criteria. And these are the 4 basic parts to the SQL query. Again, this query is created when we click and drag from the prior screen using some more user-friendly query builder tools. So that concludes Chapter 3. I haven't said this in prior sessions, but I always encourage students to go back and read the chapter if they haven't read it before listening to our presentation and discussion here, because this discussion is not meant to substitute as a reading of the chapter. It's just simply meant to help reinforce and perhaps clarify and maybe develop the concepts discussed in the readings a little bit further. So please go back and read the chapter and make sure you're comfortable and familiar with that. And thanks very much.